Hi everyone, my name is Mike Cheney. I'm a respiratory therapist, and today we're going to go over the basics of ventilator waveforms. Some people would argue, I don't really have time to look at waveforms, but I would argue that actually waveforms will save you time if you know how to look at them. So we have 5 main waveforms on the ventilator. These on the left are called scalars. They plot something, either pressure, flow, or volume over time. So the vertical axis would be pressure, flow, and volume here, and then these would be 6-second increments on the horizontal axis. Those are called scalars. That's S-C-A-L-A-R-S. Over here we have loops. We have our pressure volume loop and our flow volume loop. So let's look at just the parts of the waveform that we can see. First of all, you can look at the peak inspiratory pressure on anything with the pressure. So here, it's going to be around 20. Of course, you can see that right above there printed out, but we're looking at the waveforms right now. And while you can look here at the 20, it's nice to be able to compare breath to breath visually. And then over here, we can look at the pressure volume loop and see that it's 20 as well. We can also look at flow, and this would be inspiratory and expiratory. Inspiratory on the flow time scalar is above the line, and expiratory would be on the underside of the line. And you can also, by the way, see the waveform, the flow waveform. In this case, they call it the ramp or decelerating. Delivers most of the flow at the beginning into the large airways, and it kind of slows down when it's hitting the smaller airways. It does deliver, lower pressures by doing that. I'll just switch it to show you that really quickly. See, we're going to get some higher pressures. This delivers the same flow the whole time, and it changes the shape of our pressure waveform too. Now, actually, I have this hooked into something with almost no resistance, so the pressure didn't change a lot, but it's negligible right here. But if we had some airway resistance like in a real lung, you would see that once this higher flow hits the smaller airways, it's delivering the higher flow at the end of the breath. It gets down to the small airways, it's going to generate more pressure. We'll go ahead and switch that back to the decelerating waveform. Okay. We can also look at peep, and you can see our baseline here is 0, our pressure baseline. We have to look, peep is pressure, positive and expiratory pressure, so we have to look at this. And so we return to a pressure, baseline pressure of 0 in the lung here. So let's go ahead and add some peep. You can be thinking about what the waveform is going to do. It's going to change our baseline, and so now you see our baseline has moved up between the 0 and the 10 because we have 5 of peep set. And if we increase it farther, it'll go up farther. By the way, all of this area below the lines, that is all positive pressure. So you can just visually see the more peep we add, the bigger the volume, the more frequent the breaths, there's going to be more area under those lines. It's going to increase your mean airway pressure. So one of the things we can do is determine what type of breath it is. And so we're in SIMV volume control right now. So these are all timed controlled breaths. And you can see that it's a positive pressure breath. So the pressure on inspiration is above the line, and then it goes exhale down to baseline. If I were to trigger an extra breath without pressure support, what's going to happen is inspiration and exhalation flips. So if you think about it, a non-pressure supported breath, spontaneous one, they're going to pull inspiration below the line. They're going to pull pressure out of the circuit, and then exhalation is going to go up. So let's take a look at that. I'm just going to trigger a breath here. You can see right there. Oh, it caught a machine breath there. And there's another one. You can see spontaneous breath, inspiration is down, exhalation is up. Let's add some pressure support. And what we can predict is that we're gonna set a pressure support of 10, so we're gonna go 10 above baseline. So it's still gonna be this shark fin, but when the patient triggers a breath and it's pressure supported, that is positive pressure, so it's gonna go above the line. It's decelerating on its flow, so it's gonna create a shark fin just like this. And it's gonna go above the line, a little pressure supported breath, but it's gonna be smaller than the machine breath. And here we go. Okay, that's a machine breath. That's a pressure supported breath. I think I pulled a little hard there. There we go. So that's a pressure supported breath. You see it's smaller than the other. And now we're back to our machine breaths. What I was saying before about the inspiratory flow waveform does change the shape of the waveform. Decelerating is what we use the most. Like we said before, it delivers most of the flow to the larger airways because they get the air first when the breath is delivered. Then as the breath inspiration continues, flow gets lower as it hits the smaller airways, yields lower peak inspiratory pressure, and this decelerating creates a shark fin on the pressure. We can also look at our pressure volume loop. Positive pressure goes this way. I'm going to add some more peep to exaggerate this. So this is pressure going this way. So our baseline, you can see it on the pressure waveform. We added peep, it raises it a little bit. Well, it moves this away from 0. You can see here, this is 0. But we're starting over here at 10 because I have a peep of 10. So now the breath starts there. And pressure builds on inspiration and decreases on exhalation. So positive pressure breaths are gonna go that way. Think about this though. What if we had a non-pressure supported spontaneous breath? Think about what's gonna happen. Spontaneous non-pressure supported breath, they're gonna pull a negative pressure. So you're gonna see the waveform is gonna go below. It's gonna go to this side because this is negative pressure. And as they pull in a negative pressure, volume's gonna fill. It's just a picture of what we're doing. Spontaneous non-pressure supported breath, you pull in negative pressure and your lungs fill with volume. Pull in negative pressure, lungs fill with volume. So let's do that. You can see it drops below. Now, it doesn't take much negative pressure to pull in volume, so it's kind of hard to see, but you can see it drops below and the lungs fill, just like we said. And there's a positive pressure. So over to our loops. Again, we can see the peak pressure, we can see the amount of volume that was delivered, and how those two relate to one another. And if you think about it, the volume pressure relationship really refers to lung compliance. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. And on the pressure volume loop, inspiration is on the bottom limb of the loop, exhalation is on the top. You can watch that go. Okay, I'm gonna try to create some scenarios here for you of things that you might see in the hospital on a ventilator with a patient. I'm gonna try to create these as best I can. I don't have a real lung, and nor do I have a sick lung. Actually, what I have is a test lung, spring and bellows, as my my person that the vent is attached to. But it is, a big cavernous bellows. It has no airways or any kind of resistance. When I add resistance, I'm actually going to be using this small ET tube and some corrugated tubing with some paper towels and tissues stuffed in it for my resistance. So again, that's not going to be like real life, but we'll do the best we can. All right. One of the things that I really do need a real person for, hooked to a real lung, but this is an important use of waveforms, is to determine if your eye time is set appropriately in pressure control. Now, on my YouTube channel, I have a whole video about this, and if you want to check that out, I would suggest you go there, because I go into it in pretty good depth. But basically, you know, if your eye time is set too short, the flow is going to go into the patient, pressure is going to build as flow goes in, but the time is going to cut it off before the lung is done filling. So what you see is a less than expected peak inspiratory pressure. On this vent, it would stack the pressure on top of the peep. So if you're expecting inspiratory pressure and a peep of 5 to hit 25 and you're only hitting 18, then you know that lung doesn't have time to fill. And you want to lengthen the eye time on pressure control so that the lung fills, flow returns to 0, and you have that hold time before exhalation begins, because pressure control is time cycled. So again, check that out on my video. Another thing I really can't mimic on here is on the pressure volume loop, the bird beak. When you have exceeded the distensible elastic properties of the lung and pressure continues to build, but volume doesn't really build. You're getting ready to pop a lung there, you know, lung trauma. And what you'll see is it'll come to a point on the volume and pressure will build, so it gets a little hook out here. It's called a bird beak. And the fix for that is to use a lower volume. And so you'll drop your volume by very little, and the pressure will drop by a pretty good amount at that point. So those are the two things I really can't show you. Everything else I'm going to do my best here. Okay, so one of the things we can do is set this little guy down here. This is flow acceleration, and I do again have a YouTube video about flow acceleration if you want to go into it a little more in depth. But this is the I like the way they name it, flow acceleration. It's not the peak flow, it is how fast it reaches the peak flow. So for example, in your car, you can go 0 to 60 in a short amount of time, or 0 to 60 in a longer amount of time. You're still gonna hit the same peak speed, but how fast you get to that speed is what we're doing here. That's set primarily for patient comfort. You wouldn't think it would make a big difference, but it does. Sometimes, you know, patients who are air hungry, you know, they want to get their flow really fast, in which case on this ventilator, we would set this up. We'd set it to be faster. And so that will push the acceleration in faster. This waveform goes a little, it stands up a little faster because it's, you know, it's a straighter, more vertical inspiratory limb there. And the problem you can get with that is that if there's a lot of resistance in the way, or you know, it's just too much, you'll get a little pressure overshoot. And you know, certainly it does create more turbulent flow, which does not help distribution and ventilation. So patients like their flow faster, but sometimes you create poor distribution, ventilation, and turbulent flow. So you got to find a happy medium there. And then if I slow this back down, you'll be able to see it'll lay down, like the inspiratory limb will be more on a slant. You can see it kind of lays over a little bit, but there's no pressure overshoot. So I'm just going to put this back at something reasonable. Let's just put it at 50. All right, let's talk about airway resistance. So right now, I have, you can see the settings here, and I have a pressure of 19. Take a look at what my pressure volume loop looks like. Note how fat it is, the distance between here and here. Okay, look at the shape of the flow volume loop. And I'm gonna add a bunch of resistance now. Okay, let's look at what changes. Oh, look at our pressure volume loop. Remember how thin it was before? That's airway resistance. So we can say that the fatter this loop, the more resistance there is. You can see that from across the room. Then you can start thinking about causes of resistance. You know, some common ones would be, you know, bronchospasm, airway inflammation, mucus in the airway, maybe they need suctioned. Our flow volume loop, which was a nice rounded, kind of typical looking flow volume loop, now has this characteristic spike with a scoop out of it, and it's more drawn out. We see that with obstructive diseases. Also, when we add resistance, we can grab a plateau. There'll be a bigger difference between peak and the plateau with resistance. So let's go ahead. I'm going to take the resistance out for a second and show you this. Oh, and look, our loop is back to the same. We got a skinny pressure volume loop. Okay, now we've got a peak of 19, and I took the resistance out, and it's just blowing into open bellows there. So there's really a negligible amount of resistance there. So my peak should be very close to my plateau. Let's see if we're right here. And we have 19 and 18. So that's a difference of 1. That's negligible. So let's add some resistance. But here, look at our waveform. The peak and the plateau, the difference, very minimal visually. So let's add our resistance. And watch what it does. Look at that. The bigger the difference between peak and plateau, we have more resistance there. And numerically we do as well, 21 and 16. It was 19 and 18. Now our peak went up because whenever we have airway resistance in the way, the peak does go up some. And you can see the difference between the PIP and the P-plat has become much greater. So we can see that on that waveform as well. Okay, now let's look at compliance changes. So I'm going to put this back to what it was. Give it a minute to catch up to itself. Now, when we talk about compliance changes, that's the relationship between volume and pressure. And so if we think about which one of these waveforms would best represent the relationship between volume and pressure, well, hopefully you would say the pressure volume loop. We talked about resistance and its effect on that loop. The fatter it is, the more resistance there is. The thinner there it is, the less resistance there is. That's useful. You can see that from across the room. You can also see compliance from across the room. We could mathematically do this. We could look at the volume and divide it by the pressure. You calculate compliance. We can also visually see it. And so think about stiff lung, lower compliance. That's going to be, at a given volume, it's going to have higher pressure. Think about that. At a given volume, the pressure is going to be higher. So this waveform with a stiffer lung is going to lay down. A less stiff lung, it's going to stand up. So let's make our lung stiffer here. Now obviously our peak pressure is going to go up too. And let's see what our waveform does here. And I just moved it a little bit. You can see it's laying down already. I'm trying to make it not alarm. And there we go. You can see it's less compliant. I made the test lung stiffer, and it's laying down a lot here. And there we go. Now I'm going to take it off. Well, I moved the compliance adjustment back too far, too fast, and I had a huge volume overshoot. I had to wait for it to catch up to itself, so I cut that part out of the video. But you can see I have very low compliance. Peak pressure's down. The volume, the pressure volume loop is now standing up more. So again, the more it lays down, the stiffer the lung, the more it stands up, the less stiff the lung. Another thing I can't really show you too well on here because this test lung does not act like a real lung, and that is one that has a exaggerated lower inflection point. So if we were to have a very stiff lung, like somebody with ARDS or pulmonary edema, what would happen is we'd have this big rise in pressure, and then it has to overcome like this critical opening pressure. Kind of like when you blow up a new balloon, you have to push really hard, and then it just kind of gets over that hump, and then it becomes easier to blow up. Same thing here. Surfactant makes it so that we don't normally have to breathe that way, but if somebody has not enough surfactant production, maybe they got O2 toxicity, they got ARDS, they got fluid in there, so it's insufficient amounts, you're going to have an exaggerated lower inflection point. So you have a big pressure rise, and then you'll see a little change in direction of the loop, and then it'll start going up. So basically, you've got the situation where every time that lung exhales, it goes below that lower inflection point or that critical opening pressure, and then to reopen it, it's got to overcome that pressure, and that's damaging to the lungs. It creates atelic trauma and shear force trauma and things like that. So when you see an exaggerated lower inflection point, you really should set the PEEP at or 1 or 2 above that, where that point is, and that way it doesn't allow the lung to deflate down past that critical opening pressure, that lower inflection point, which reduces it having to kind of rip itself open when the new breath comes in. It's a much more gentle way to ventilate our patients. Okay, let's talk about leaks for a minute. I'm trying to hold a plug and just partially in to create a little leak here, just to show you what it does. But when there's a big leak in the system, obviously you're going to have significantly dropped in tidal volumes, maybe low exhale tidal volume alarm, low pressure alarms, things like that, and certainly our peak has dropped. So those are numerical things, but this is about waveforms. So you can see our volume waveform doesn't really build because it doesn't deliver all the volume because it's leaking out. And if you notice, we're supposed to have a peep of 5, but you notice that the peep kind of trails off as it's leaking out. It's not holding that pressure in there. And then we'll fix our leak here and see how things change. And there we go. You can see our peep is held, our volume waveform starting to look a little healthier there. And so that's how you can tell leaks. All right, now we're going to talk about air trapping. Certainly we can measure air trapping with the expiratory hold button, but we can also see it, we can visualize it. Again, this is one of those useful tools so you don't have to measure anything, you can see it from across the room. So you can see air trapping. There's a few different ways. I think this one's the easiest because this is the waveform that's usually up. Okay, so let's look at our flow over time scalar. This again on a positive pressure breath is inspiratory, decelerating flow waveform, and then this is exhalation. So when they go to exhale, let's think about what that's doing. Initially, we have a higher exhalation flow, and then just like in real life, as you're finishing exhaling, your expiratory flow kind of trails off and goes to 0. So that's what's happening here. The flow gets slower and slower and slower as it gets closer to the 0 baseline, and then once it hits 0, it's done. So flow is trailing off, it returns to 0 before the next breath begins. And so visually, there's no air trapping there. Now, if you think about what causes air trapping, there's lots of different causes, but they all boil down to the same concept, and that is there's not enough time to exhale what's in your lungs before the new breath comes. So what we're going to do is create that situation. So I'm going to crank this rate up because that's going to shorten my E time enough to where they're not going to have enough time to exhale before the new breath comes. All right, look at my peak pressure. It's 27. Okay, see, we're cranking away. My peak pressure is going up because those breaths are being trapped in there. And if you notice, expiratory flow goes exhaling, 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 and then it didn't get a chance to return to 0 before the new breath started. You can see it, that never does reach baseline, and then the new breath starts. Visually, there's air trapping there. Whether it's significant or how much, well, you'd have to calculate that. But you can see that this patient is not done exhaling before the new breath starts. Okay, let's talk about some issues with sensitivity. Sensitivity, trigger dysynchrony with the patient can happen for multiple reasons. You might be running a flow meter, powering a nebulizer from an external flow meter that the ventilator doesn't know about. You could have air trapping, that'll mess it up, the triggering. Sensitivity can lock the patient out. Could be due to leaks, cuff leaks, chest tube leaks, all kinds of different things. We're going to talk about pressure sensitivity issues, and we are in pressure sensitivity right now. And let me put it at a normal. Let's go to, all right, you can see when we go to trigger a breath, it drops down a little bit below baseline. Okay, so there's peep of 5. It's going to drop to 3. That's a -2 there from where it is, and that's all good. All right, let's say that we have the sensitivity set too high. This is definitely too high. You're going to lock people out doing that. But when you go to trigger, you can see they have to pull way down. So anytime you see that big pull down, your patient is working hard to trigger that breath. And you might have some kind of sensitivity issues that the ventilator doesn't know about, maybe something I named previously. All right, so we want to definitely fix that. I know people probably use flow sensitivity. Problem with flow sensitivity, if you're given an inhaler, is that a lot of that medication just gets whipped right around to the exhalation side because there's that constant base flow going through there. So when we give inhalers, we really should switch to pressure sensitivity so that you don't have that flow kind of blowing that medication into the expiratory side, because then it's certainly not going to the patient. All right, let's talk about air hunger. Now, a lot of our modes that we use nowadays, the patient can override the flow and pull as much as they want. And that's a great thing, because I can't imagine anything worse than being air hungry. But if we're using modes like VC, where they don't override it, then what you're gonna get is dips out of the pressure waveform. And so we do this, we're gonna pull. You can see there, it's different configurations depending on how they pull. So you'll see these dips. So pressure's building, but then as the flow, the inspiratory flow starts to drop, they get air hunger. They say, no, I want more flow. So initially it might be okay, and then they'll pull that little dip out of the peak. I'll try to mimic that again so you can see it. Yeah, there it is. And then there's, less significant ones where it just kind of gets rounded. And those are air hungry too. The alarm that you'll get if somebody is air hungry is they'll get a low pressure alarm without a low exhaled tidal volume alarm. Historically, back before patients could override the flow and pull as much as they want, I used to get calls like this. Patient wakes up, they get scared, they start pulling hard, and the call that I would get is, I'm getting a low pressure alarm, but the tidal volume alarm is not going off, the low exhaled tidal volumes. They're getting all their volume, and I always knew then it was an air hunger issue, because they're getting the volume, they're pulling the volume that the ventilator's delivering, but because they're pulling it so fast, they're pulling so hard, they're actually pulling pressure out of the circuit and creating a low pressure alarm. The last thing I'm going to show you is how to identify secretions on a waveform. Now, obviously, there's other ways to identify whether your patient has secretions that need to be suctioned out. Obviously hearing them or auscultating them. or you see them in the tube. But because this presentation is about waveforms, we're also going to look at them there, because sometimes they're not real obvious on auscultation or hearing them. Sometimes you might have a little bit of pluggy stuff kind of bouncing around at the bottom of the tube, and it's, causes problems sometimes, but you can't really hear it. So this is a still picture of an actual ventilator patient, and I'm gonna play the video for you here shortly, but I wanted to freeze it because the video is not very long, because the patient needed suction, so I didn't want to hold that off. But if you look at this middle one, I think the best way to identify secretions on waveforms is by looking at the flow over time scalar. And obviously you can see here in this middle one, we have the decelerating inspiratory flow, and then during exhalation we have these oscillations. Now this patient, as you'll hear in the video, did have things you can, secretions you can hear, but you can also see them on there, and they're pretty significant ones. Typically the ones at the beginning of exhalation, if there's oscillations up there and they're large, that's going to be closer to the upper airway, maybe bouncing around the bottom of the tube. Sometimes you have smaller ones toward the end of exhalation, and those would be, some smaller airway secretions. These are all the way through because there were a lot of them, and you can see it also affects the pressure waveform as well. On the waveform, the flow over time scalar before that, it was so much that it didn't even, it messed the flow up on the inspiratory side as well. So I'll go ahead and play the video for you now. And here you can see the moving images of what we just talked about, and you can hear the secretions. Okay, well that's it for now. Hopefully you enjoyed this overview of ventilator graphics. Don't forget to check out my other respiratory related videos on my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.